it's always a thrill to do something together with Bill. I mean, Bill has been, a friend and a fellow traveler in Japanese affairs, Japanese economics, and it's wonderful. You can see the full biography, obviously out here, but it's very interesting because his claim to fame, he is actually one of the very, very few men and women who did predict the end of the bubble economy. His first book, was your first?
Yes.
Was called The Sun Also Sets, and it came out in 1989. And any of us who've been here in Japan in 1989, I mean, the sky was the limit. Japan was going to take over. Bill very succinctly, very eloquently, just made a very soft-spoken argument that, cycles do exist, pressure points exist. Now here we are, almost 40 years later, a whole generation later, the bubble has collapsed. A whole lot of things that I think very, very few people would have predicted, have actually occurred. And we're in a geo-economic, condition that, quite frankly, we haven't been in, right, ever before. The world is reorganizing with a whole bunch of forces going on. And Bill, I'm really thrilled, to learn your thoughts on the role of middle powers. It's obviously, we've got the United States, we've got the People's Republic of China as the two hyperpowers, but the rest of the world, including Japan, where do we go from here? What are your thoughts on the emerging global order?
Well, thank you very much, Jesper. It's always a thrill to do things together with you, Jesper, of course. And especially, I learn so much from Jesper every quarter when we do a seminar together for the Asia Society and for the Japan Society of the UK. So it's a delight to be here in person, actually, in the same physical territory as you. What I'm going to do is just say a few things about the geopolitical turbulence that we're in and what, if any, significance that has for the economy and for being for Japan. And I will preface it by saying that actually I tend to feel better about all that geopolitical turbulence and about all the scare stories that we see and people like me write about what's going on in the world. I feel better every time I come to Japan because I feel actually rooted and safe in a certain sense, but actually that's not just an illusion. Japan is an exemplar of why we shouldn't pay so much attention to the sort of fashionable phrases that come up, that particularly writers like me have an incentive to come up with, that we are in a new Cold War, that we are in kind of unprecedented geopolitical turbulence, that great power competition is now ruling the globe, that the US is now, as Stephen Walt from Harvard has described it, a predatory hegemon, that everything is about rupture, as Mark Carney put it, the Canadian Prime Minister in Davos in his brilliant speech there. I want to ask myself, first of all, and ourselves, what have we actually learned during what you could call 5, 6, 7 years of this kind of new Cold War, turbulence, territorial expansionism, breach of the old international order that we've been seeing? What have we learned about what the signal is rather than the noise? And then what are the implications, as you say, for the middle powers? What have we learned? I would say, first of all, we've learned that superpowers, which I would include US and China, but also one has to include Russia in that because of its nuclear weapons. Superpowers are aggressive bullies, but actually they're weaker than they seem. I would suggest that we've passed the point of peak superpower in terms of their salience and influence. Why do I say that? Because Russia has failed in its invasion of Ukraine. It's lost more than 1 million casualties, million and a half casualties to achieve almost nothing territorially in four years. The US has clearly failed in its war on Iran, on almost every measure, in achieving whatever objectives it had. China has not been doing things like that, but I would suggest that the 12-year anti-corruption campaign, or even maybe it's 15 years now, of Xi Jinping, can't exactly be succeeding, since there's a new person sent to jail every week, and that actually the system is not as stable as it seems. So I think we are passing the point of peak superpower. Globalization. We hear that we're in a period of deglobalization. The sense that free movement of trade and finance must be under threat. I think what we've learned, certainly over the last 2 years, under the second Trump administration, is that free movement of trade, finance, and services can survive even the rejection of that system by the godfather of globalization, the United States. What we are seeing is de-Americanization in goods trade to some degree, or there's diversion away from America, but not deglobalization. Indeed, world trade, and in particular world services trade, but also goods trade, are growing strongly. We've learned, thirdly, that energy and commodity shocks are less shocking than they used to be. If I think for Japan, how many so-called shocks have we seen in the last 5 years? We've seen the Ukraine energy shock. We've seen the Iran energy shock, the commodity shocks as well. We've seen scares about critical minerals and so forth. What have their effect been on the Japanese economy? Marginal, not central. Of course there is some effect, but it's marginal. It's not like in 1973. It's not the cause of a complete rethinking. Now, this may be also because the duration of this shock is as yet unclear and known, but also because simply they are less significant than they used to be. Fourth, we are learning, and we should have learned, and we should realize that economic power, despite the kind of sense of great power rivalry and so forth, is actually becoming more dispersed. It is not becoming more concentrated. The spread of economic development around the world that has been misnamed the rise of the global south is actually the rise of the global, because the increase of agency, the increase of participation, the increase of wealth in markets, especially in Southeast Asia and South Asia, but also all over the world, is so strong. Southeast Asia in particular is as long ago, as you all know better than I do, was moved away from being a hub and spoke, dependent and connected, critically to China, to becoming more of a spider's web, a network of markets and production and supply chains that basically increase the resilience, but also critically increase the number of options. Fifth, we know for sure that America is now a variable and not a constant. We don't know what will follow Donald Trump, but we do know that an oscillation in American policy will continue. And indeed that the oscillation of American policy will, at least compared with the consistency of policy on some metrics, at least during the Cold War and in the 1990s, the oscillation could now be quite extreme. We also know that America still has global interests and global exposure, so that isolationism, retreat is not an option, but oscillation between forms of engagement is absolutely going to be the name of the game. We know that. But we also know, and Jesper knows better than I do, that America, in investment terms, and to some degree in economic terms, but investment terms, carries now concentration risk quite severely because of what's going on in the markets and the imbalanced nature of the markets. So all of these phenomena lead, I think, to a sort of clear conclusion. And it's a conclusion that reminds me of sitting in the Foreign Correspondents Club in the 1980s, receiving frequent speeches from the then foreign minister, Abe Shintaro, father of Abe Shinzo, of course, who came up with a slogan that actually all of us journalists laughed at. It was called, his theme was omnidirectional diplomacy. And we laughed at it because we thought we didn't know what it meant, and we didn't think he knew either at the time. But the truth, of course, is that he was ahead of his time in this sense, in that that is the name of the game now. It is an idea whose time has come. Why? Because it's clear in economic terms that stability and resilience comes from diversification, as every investor is taught, but also that is the case diplomatically. If you have tied all yourself to one camp, to one dependency, you are at high diplomatic risk, and absolutely the name of the game for every country, particularly Japan, but for India, for the UK, for Australia, for others, is diversification of their diplomatic options. That is where the middle powers come in. I think a second conclusion that we can draw from the picture that I've painted is that self-sufficiency, which is a natural reaction to some of the dependency risk that has arisen from the turning of economic exchange into coercive instruments. Now, across the Pacific, but previously particularly focused on China, self-sufficiency is an understandable target, but it's a costly and dangerous delusion. Diversification of supplies is a much more coherent and affordable, but also likely to be resilient solution. Why have those shocks, the energy and commodity shocks, not been worse than they seem? And it's partly because GDP and output is less energy dependent than it used to be, but principally it's because supply chains have adapted quite smoothly and quickly, just as they did to blockages during the COVID pandemic and others. And that is because of the diversification of the global economy and of the dispersion of power. So it means that the case for the free and open Indo-Pacific, for the great slogan that Prime Minister Takaichi is now renewing, the case for that freedom and openness, which when it was first made was a case for an argument for trying to bring India in and connect America into that system or bind America into that system, is really now a case for adaptability and resilience, an investment, a necessary investment in the dispersion of power, support for that dispersion of power by, I think, the very important relationship that Japan has with the Philippines, for example, but also with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with others, in order to accelerate and enhance that dispersion of economic and therefore military power that's taking place in order to build a resilient and adaptable system. So in the end, the reality is that the role of the middle powers, and we call them middle powers simply to contrast them with superpowers, but if you are in Japan and you think of it as a middle power, that's extraordinary, really, to think of a country of this strength and sophistication and scale as being middle. But what we are all getting from each other as middle powers, from the UK getting from Japan, Japan getting from Germany, Germany getting from Australia, Canada getting from all of the above, is optionality, is the spread of greater options, diplomatically, economically, technologically, and the possibility that we can influence the great powers. Mark Carney gave his speech in Davos in January, which was particularly admirable to any journalist and writer because he said more in 17 minutes than most people say in 2 hours in these speeches. But also, in a very real sense, what he was saying was valuable because it was an inspiration to explore every connection that you can as a country that had become overly dependent on the United States, in Canada's case, that thought that it had a long-term relationship of trust with the United States, but then was rudely determined and shown that this wasn't the case. It's popular and common here in Tokyo to say there is no plan B, that absolutely the relationship with the United States in security terms is not substitutable. And that is true. The contrast with Europe is that in Europe, while we don't want the United States to withdraw from NATO, we can actually defend ourselves against Russia without them, without the United States. That would not be true for Japan with China, of course. But it's not really a question, is the point I want to leave you with. It's not really a question of having a plan B or a plan C. It's making plan A more resilient to the potential changes in the world, more resilient to the swirling tides of economic and political fortune. Making plan A more resilient is a question of diversifying all sorts of sources of technology, diversifying markets, diversifying diplomatic tools, precisely, I think, in order to make plan A less vulnerable to the caprices that may come in and out of the White House. So all I would finish with is to say, if I've spoken for more than 17 minutes, I apologize to the Canadian Prime Minister for not doing as well as he did. But secondly, that I think Japan is a great example for how to follow omnidirectional diplomacy now, and to develop options wherever they could be found. Right. And that's what I like to follow.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bill, for these remarks. One sort of, could you explore a little bit deeper? It's nice to talk about omnidirectionality. It is nice to talk about and highlight, which I think is very true, the incredible resilience of the global system, right, so far, despite the fact that, you know, America has changed tack quite dramatically. On the other hand, the dominance of the United States is incredible. If you look at technology, where do technologies at scale come from? Fine, try and do without Google and Microsoft.
Right.
If you look at the defense rail, right? So you've got technology, you've got defense. The demonstration of logistical expertise that has been demonstrated in the engagement in Iran is unprecedented. This is not an incremental improvement, but this is a quantum leap in terms of, you know, the exact number of targets that are being hit, you know, in unbelievably short time. Compare that to all the previous, you know, military engagement that we've had. China cannot do that. Only the United States can do that. And then last but not least, you've got technology, you've got defense, the utter dominance in the payments rails, right? You and I doing any form of transaction financially, whether it's you transferring something to your, you know, to your cousin, or whether it's JP Morgan transferring something to Mitsubishi Bank, this is all the United States of America. So we've got this veneer of omnilateralism, and the pressure is there, but at the end, the hub and spoke, the nervous system and the lifeblood continues to be made in America, with all the rules actually making you more, not less dependent on the United States of America. Discuss.
That's the...
I thought I'd just be a German realist.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
No, well, so I think that the... first of all, militarily, let's address that question. What you've described is absolutely true, but what has been happening in Iran suggests that it's not important.
Right.
Or it may be important in certain kind of conflict situations, but it hasn't actually made a decisive strategic difference. It's a tactical advantage, not a strategic one. So it is a demonstration of capability, for sure. But where has it got CENTCOM? It hasn't actually made the decisive difference. On technological dependence, I mean, I think in terms of that corporate involvement, certainly my point about self-sufficiency being a costly delusion fits there. I mean, I don't think we can. I mean, the French desire to have a French AI or a French rival to all sorts of things. Well, good luck is basically my belief. I mean, I do think that is likely to be a delusion in all sorts of ways. But the question that you have to ask yourself as a company, as a government, dealing with U.S. technology firms can you get into a position where they need you as much as you need them, or is it the other way around? Generally, the U.S. tech companies, Google, Microsoft, etc., have played ball or not violently protested against the Digital Services Act and European regulation. Why? Because they need the European market, and they're prepared to pay that price for access. They'd rather not, and if they can use the U.S. government to try to bully the European Commission and European governments to drop that regulation or to not develop it, then yes, of course they'll do that, which is why they were all at Trump's inauguration. But ultimately, if they fail, they'll still be there. So as a government, you have to ask yourself, well, what relationships might I get myself in where that wouldn't be the case, that they wouldn't need me that much? And I do think that that's the reason why Palantir is more controversial for certain critical technological uses, particularly in defense and cybersecurity and so forth. Not generally. I don't think it matters that they are offering data services to the National Health Service. It's either good or bad, rather, and that's obviously a big customer. But would I want them running my cybersecurity agency in Japan? Well, probably not, because I want to make sure that I've got some leverage back. So I think that that's the sort of criterion that you have to use. Absolutely, the U.S. Continues to be, the dollar, I think, is continuing to be the most dominant, the clearly dominant country. Currency, all predictions of its decline have been proved wrong. And I think that will continue for as long, unless there was an actual an economic collapse in America that destroyed that credibility. So they have a resilient system as well, the resilience to their own mistakes.
Right. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I think that ultimately the question comes is, okay, well, if Europe doesn't like the dominance of, just to pick a name, Google, right, then develop your own system. If you don't like Facebook, develop your own system. Why are you not developing your own system? That's the question that I actually don't have an answer to. Because I don't think, omnilateralism, right? So everybody has some sort of force, and there's attraction, and there's, this. We're not there yet, right? We're only not even in the first inning, as the Americans would say, right? At the diplomatic level, yes, because it's very obvious that what Mr. Trump does at Davos is very different from what Mr. Carney does at Davos, right? It's very clear, my way or the highway, and I'm the greatest. Fine. But, we're only at the very, very beginning. Draw this out to me. Where do you think, some people believe that there's going to be these blocks, right? That you've got an Asia-Pacific bloc, China, Asia-Pacific bloc, Europe, sort of the coalition of the winning, led by the Germans, obviously. Sorry, no, but where do you think in 10 years' time we're going to be?
Well, my guess is that we will not have blocs. I remember Kenichi Omai forecasting blocs probably in somewhere like 1992. Right. I mean, and that's perhaps the earliest I remember, but I'm sure you could go back and find others, and then you'd find them, roughly once a decade, there will be a best-selling book based on the new regionalized economy and diplomatic blocs. But they don't make any sense. And therefore, they are always going to be quite limited in their reach. Why would you restrict China wants to dominate its strategic space militarily, but the Chinese economy wants to have connections with the whole world. So I don't see the benefit to China of seeking to build a bloc, actually. Right. It wants its tentacles everywhere because prosperity comes from that. So I think the forces of technological innovation and the forces of relatively free trade militates against that kind of blockism,
right?
Really.
So omnilateralism, every man for himself, and building up, trust no one, right? But talk to everybody and cut deals with everybody, and be nimble and flexible. Great. What's the role of what is the role of the international institutions that have been built up since the end of the Second World War? Like, is the UN going to be around?
Well, the UN will never die because it provides a place for all sorts of
dinners
and people, places to hide and things to happen and so forth. Institutions don't disappear.
But it's a real problem. I'm a Japanese company.
Yes.
I've been hit by a tariff from the United States of America. Under trade rules, right, I can file a claim with the WTO.
Yeah.
Every CEO that asks me whether they should file a claim with the WTO, I say it's a waste of money. Why would you do this? Because nothing is going to change in the United States of America, which happens to be my most profitable and most important market.
Yeah. No. Yes.
Yeah. So what do you? I'm asking very seriously because I think the world has built up this institutional framework.
Yeah.
Multilateralism, rules-based orders, the UN, the World Health Organization, you name it, right? Are all in there. Where is the relevance of them, since they're not going to be the mediators, because the mediators are going to be you talking to me, Takaichi talking to Modi. That's going to be the resolution and the enforcement channel, rather than some third neutral agency.
Well, I think that's right, but I don't know. I don't feel able to predict securely that. Why? Because the saliency of these institutions depends on the interests of the great powers in that and of the multiplicity of countries. So the WTO grew and became salient because it was convenient at that time to Europe and to North America and actually to Asian countries to develop it. And then a country like America decided that it no longer thought that it was actually the best way to resolve disputes. Right. So it is still there to resolve disputes between non-American, between other traders, and still does to some degree. It's not a waste of time to sue about a Thai trade action against an Australian company or something. But you have to have other measures to deal with American ones, or something. So that just means that it's institutions plus. It's not possible to have them as global governance in a world where power is dispersed rather than concentrated.
So there will be no Antichrist. They will go with Peter Thiel. Exactly. Let me pivot to Japan. You're always very kind to Japan. And
Japan is always very kind to me.
This is what we do. Omotenashi. But in all seriousness, as you know, I run around with this concept Pax Nipponica.
Yes.
That Japan is in this position, to be the mediator, to be the honest broker, and the primary reason for that. And I always get thrown out of the Prime Minister's office when I say that, is actually because Japan is no longer threatening. Japan is old.
Yes.
Average age is 50.
Yes.
Right. And you're not worried about Toyota, disrupting the global transportation market. Toyota is a perfectly fine company, but the great first mover disruptor, unlikely to come from Japan. So the role as a mediator, right?
Yeah.
Pax Nipponica. From your perspective, sort of roaming the world, talking to influential people, what is Japan doing right? And what is Japan doing wrong?
Well, I think what Japan does right in this respect is consistency. Why is Japan a trusted mediator? It is partly what you say, but it's also because Japan tomorrow and Japan the day after tomorrow is expected to be the same as Japan today.
Right.
In terms of its approach, in terms of its attitude, in terms of its policy stances, and its presence.
Right.
America fluctuates in a volatile way. Japan doesn't. And I think that's the principal thing that Japan does right from this point of view. And that is obviously above all true within East and Southeast Asia, but it is true to some degree elsewhere. What limits Japan's role in that sense is that it lacks the weight these days, economically and therefore diplomatically, to be able to exploit that advantage in a very wide range of places. It doesn't any longer have the strength over capital flows. It doesn't any longer have the capabilities to be the biggest aid donor, So it's in its weight that where I think it is limited. Are there other mistakes?
Let me be more specific,
Yes.
since you're not an ambassador and you can speak freely. We've got a woman prime minister who doesn't take no for an answer. She's very stubborn, but she's got grand ambitions, right?
Yep.
Your sort of judgment of what does, Takaichi compared, and you've been around. You've met with several of the people who pretended to run the country and of people who actually did run the country over the last 30 years. Where does Takaichi come in?
Well, I think that she has two clear big strengths. The main one is the probability that she will still be in office.
Right.
In 2, 3, 4 years' time.
Just like England.
Yeah. Well, it's true that England proves that with a landslide majority, you're never safe. but it's true. But nonetheless, why was Shinzo Abe so influential? Because he was prime minister for 8 years.
Right.
And he was able to consistently carry the message and be there and deliver.
Yep.
And revolving door prime ministers can't do that.
Right.
And Takaichi does not look like a revolving door prime minister right now. Whether we're right or wrong, history will tell us, but she doesn't look that. Secondly, she does use a language and a style that is very direct and therefore leaves less room for misinterpretation. That got her in trouble with the Chinese. But nonetheless, it is, I think, an asset in that sort of international diplomacy and international activity. The essential question is, can she deliver? Can she deliver the goods in terms of the Japanese economy, in terms of the real reforms that she's talking about domestically, but also that have some connections to what she can do overseas? I'd say at the moment she has the benefit of the doubt, because it looks like she ought to be able to deliver at least some of that.
Right.
So I think that is why she currently looks a pretty strong international figure within the range of expectations about what Japan can do.
Bill, explain to me the People's Republic of China. I know nothing about China. The reason Takaichi called the election is not because she has some super Machiavellian acumen, right, of needling the Chinese, and then she just said what everybody else says in Japan, not even in the bars, but in open sessions. And the Chinese react very strongly. I think it was, what's the name of that German guy Von Clausewitz, the great war strategist,
Yes.
right? Never disturb your enemy while he's making a mistake. And I mean, if you're the People's Republic of China, at least from my limited sort of vantage point, America, is making plenty of mistakes to annoy everybody.
Yes.
And to build seed mistrust, everywhere in the world, including here in Japan, right? Yet the reaction by the People's Republic of China vis-a-vis Japan is like, oh my God, there's every 10 days, there's some new sort of little needling. You take the panda bears away,
yes.
right? And then you take the rare earth away, and then you take the ice cream away. Or you take the shiitake mushrooms is going to be next. And then, my friends tell me now the Chinese are ramping up. There's a matcha shortage. China is ramping up matcha production so that they can have Japan on the hook on the matcha shortage. Anyway, sorry. But in all seriousness, explain to me the Japan-China relationship and why has it become so acrimonious?
Well, I think part of the answer is that it's always been quite acrimonious. So the question is, why is it less one day and more the next?
Yep.
I think that's the framework for the Japan-China relationship. I think that my interpretation of China is that it chooses to torment Japan when it doesn't want to actually directly confront the United States. And I think currently it's using Japan as a proxy, little kind of weakener of, as it were, what it sees as the American camp, because it doesn't see benefit in being directly head-to-head with the United States. By and large, probably the thing that has puzzled me most in Chinese behavior in recent years is why have this wolf warrior diplomacy, which is clearly this particularly the Osaka guy is clearly a wolf warrior, squared in all sorts.
2.0.
2.0. That's right. But what is really the benefit of that?
Right.
And part of the answer is, in English football terms, this is known as the Millwall approach. Millwall Football Club in London used to have, its supporters had a song, and the song was, "Everybody hates us, we don't care." And to some degree, that's China's attitude, which is we are the Middle Kingdom.
Right.
It doesn't matter, So I think that in understanding Chinese policy, you have to put these external activities into perspective and say, actually, they are unimportant from a Chinese point of view. They look important to us, but actually from Zhongnanhai in Beijing, it's just a detail.
Right.
So that's point one. And related to that, everyone speculates, are they going to exploit Donald Trump to be able to do something with Taiwan, or are they going to do that? I think from a Chinese point of view, it's a long-term game. Xi Jinping is quite risk-averse. He's not going to do anything disastrous. He's much more likely to do a slow squeeze on Taiwan than he is to do anything crazy. Again, because thinking from a Chinese point of view, you don't take a decision like that on a suddenly a tactical basis. It's a strategic issue, but I see the relationship with Japan as purely sort of tactical niggling within a long-term framework.
What is actually very interesting, if you look at the data, actually over the last 12 months, for the first time in 7 years, Japanese foreign direct investment into the People's Republic of China is starting to rise.
Is it?
So it's not massive,
No.
But it's quite interesting that from a pragmatic perspective,
Yeah.
right? You've got obviously some scrimmages out there, but there's no question that there's no question that Takaichi, for example, the reason she called the election is exactly for everything that China did, her popularity went up by 5
Absolutely,
points.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, that was sort of a very, very strong thing. Before I open up the floor to questions from the audience and also to our audience, in the Zoom there, please prepare your questions there. Let me pivot one question that has intrigued me recently. Breakdown of the old order. Everybody's scrambling for new alliances. Yes, there's great economic resilience, but at the same time, possibly compounded by AI and the fear that us humans are going to become useless. What is the role of religion in all of this?
Oh my gosh!
No,
right.
exactly. But what I'm trying to get is I'm trying to get beyond the nation state. How many legions does the Pope has?
Yes.
Right, Mr. Lenin. Very nicely asked.
Yes.
But the reality that you look at the Middle East conflict, this is a religious conflict at its very foundations.
Yep.
Right. If you look at Russia, right, and the great sort of religious mobilization that Mr. Putin every once in a while mobilizes. Anyway, and now we've got, of course, the Pope speaking out, against both Peter Thiel and Donald Trump. What are you? How do we? As somebody who thinks about the future of the world, is religion coming back as a force?
I don't think that organized religion.
Would you like some sake?
Yes. I don't think it's coming back as a force, but I do think that it's an eternal drive of human beings is to have some kind of mechanism to understand the crazy world that they find themselves born into and the crazy people that they find themselves living with, and religion plays a constant role in that. So I don't think it is going away. At times, religious leaders gain credibility because you lose faith in the alternatives, the ones you elect and so forth. But they still have their limitations. I think when Donald Trump first learned that an American had been chosen, he thought that was a compliment to him and to the importance of America. I suspect it was partly a result of Trump that the College of Cardinals chose Leo, but it was a deliberate insult back to be able to. Why is he listened to? Because he's an American voice saying those things against Peter Thiel, saying those things against humanitarian behavior in Gaza or misbehavior in Gaza or in Iran. So yes, this was a way to elevate an alternative American voice. Right. So that instinct is always going to be there. But if you had to list the major sources of conflict or of instability in the future, I wouldn't put religion number one. I would put it on the list, but not number one.
So the reason I mentioned, I find this at the moment absolutely fascinating. That because if this brute force, might is right by the tech bros, right, taking over and telling us what the world is going to look like in the future, completely disrespecting, anything that resembles humanism, right? And the Pope speaking out.
Yes.
And before opening it up to question, to me, the most interesting development in Japan is that there is actually an open debate now about religion and the role of the emperor and the imperial family.
Of course, yes.
Which is perhaps something worthy of a future topic there, right? Any questions from the audience for Bill?
Thank you, Hendrik Ordenker. I'd like to ask you to comment on one point that the middle powers could look at as a way of stabilizing themselves, and that is to become essential to other countries, to become essential, especially to the United States and China. Taiwan maybe has the semiconductor trump card, let's call it. Where do you see Japan sitting in this area, and is Japan doing things to get its essential spot in the global economy? The strategic investment plan that Takeichi is proposing, does that help us?
I think that, that's clearly what a non-superpower wants to do. I think the essential probably is too strong a word, but valuable is the right word. In other words, I don't think that a country like Japan or name, or the UK or all sorts of other non-superpowers can or even should really seek to become to establish a critical dependency for others. They'll then become targets, and anyway, others will then quickly try to evade the control that they can offer to them. But if you become valuable as a market, valuable as a voice, valuable as a trusted network provider with all sorts of other countries, then other countries are going to come back to you time and time and time again. And I think what Japan has done in Southeast Asia has made itself very valuable to the United States, but also to anyone else who's interested in the peace, security, and prosperity of the world's fastest growing region. So I suppose the question you're addressing is that something that Japan wouldn't have done if it felt it could just rely on the United States? I think that's not been true for a long time. That's not just to do with Trump, that Japan has felt that its role was in developing long-term relationships in Southeast Asia for its own interests, but ones that also make it a valuable part of an American matrix. And so that, I think, is what Japan has been absolutely successful in doing. Now, of course, industrially, it can be very valuable. I see Ukraine thinking that it should be partnering with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries over Patriot missiles when it's manufacturing. So Japan can make itself valuable in the defense industry now in a way that it couldn't before the export controls were released. But I think it's about being valuable rather than being critical.
It's very interesting because the codependence is actually enormous. I mean, everybody likes to talk about rare earths because the Chinese happen to have a lot of them, right? But if you look at everything up from rare earth, I mean, a Boeing jet, and Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong, basically 42% of all the components are made by Japanese companies and can only be made by Japanese companies, right? The fact that you've got the revitalization, the re-engineering of the US steel industry being spearheaded by Nippon Steel. Nippon Steel last month sent 558 engineers to the United States of America because the engineers in the American factories basically had forgotten on how to operate a light switch. I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit, I'm obviously being very, very facetious here, but, I mean, just-in-time delivery and proper industrial engineering of super high-quality steel isn't done by people who used to work at a McDonald's. It's done by people who've been trained for years and years to actually be the craftsmen in doing that. And Japan is doing that. And then finally, I was very, because, whether you like it or not, Japan is the financer of the United States of America. It is the largest holding of treasuries. It is the largest holding of all private debt. It is the Japanese pension system alone owns 7% of Japanese publicly listed equities. That's real money. That's real codependence. Anyway, Kenji.
I have a little bit, so, we talk about countries punching above their weight. There are actually many countries punching below their weight. And so when the title was about the middle power, I did something very simple. I looked, because I don't know what the future will look like, but people do a pretty good job at predicting population in 10 years. It's actually quite telling because when you just rank the top countries around the world by population, you see a lot of middle powers we never talk about. And so,
right.
I'm going to give a couple examples. Number 4, so all the numbers in million of people, and that's 2035, so which is like just across the corner. So number 4, Indonesia, 304 million people.
Yeah.
Number 5, Pakistan, 300. Number 6, Nigeria, 287. Number 8, Bangladesh, 195. Number 10, you're going to love this one, Democratic Republic of Congo, They have a good football team, that's for sure. I didn't know they had 100 and, close to 200 million people. My question is, and I can go on and go on like this. By the way, France is number 25 between Tanzania and Kenya, So that gives you a bit of a story about where the world is heading at. So I guess my question is, what does middle power will do? So what is the future for these middle powers, right? Either create something like the African Union of nation-states, like Europe tried to do 50 years ago, without much success in my mind, but that's another debate for another day. Are they going to become a satellite of China or the US or India? What are they going to do? What's the playbook for this nation that we never talk about?
Well, I think that the playbook is to be a valuable and relatively autonomous nation. So if we just let's talk about Indonesia. Indonesia growing at 7% a year. If it could do that, it doubles its size in every decade. There's no way that a country that if Indonesia succeeds in following that development path, which is what it's been doing for the last 10 years, it fluctuates around it, but there's no way that it's going to be a satellite of China if it's that prosperous and that has that amount of agency. So I think that the playbook for those countries is to develop the strength through economic development and everything that it brings with it that enables them not to be satellites of others. Those who have that high population but are unsuccessful in producing rising living standards and rising economic power, those are the ones who are going to be satellites, going to be vulnerable to be satellites. So the Democratic Republic of Congo is the one of the ones you listed that has less potential at the present for being, if you like, an autonomous country with agency, whereas the others, and maybe Pakistan has less too, because it has a greater, both political, social, and economic instability that makes it dependent on others. But the path of economic development is a path towards non-satellite status.
Do you see some of these countries banging together? Like, African countries together, Pakistan, Bangladesh being together just...
Well, they already are.
Is there some kind of a trend like this, or just like forget about it, it's all by, all for himself or herself?
No, well, I don't... Let's talk, we stay with Indonesia for the moment. Indonesia is part of ASEAN. What is the purpose of ASEAN? In part, it's the same as the European Union's purpose in Europe is, which is to prevent being dominated by Germany, in a way. So ASEAN is there in order to have coherent political strategy without being dominated by the largest country of ASEAN, which is Indonesia. So the choice as ASEAN countries develop is, how do you want to have methods to try to ease your tensions and reconcile with each other, or do you want to be dominated by, as it were, the biggest kid on the block? And the potential for Indonesia is that it becomes the second biggest kid on that block, the biggest obviously being China. But I would say that those sorts of organizations will continue to have value precisely in order to kind of manage those tensions and manage those relationships. So, and the same, why not in Africa? But that doesn't make them exclusive. And the European Union's development is, we're 27 countries. We were 28 before one country rather foolishly left. Sometime in the next few years, it will go over 30, probably even up to 35. That makes the European Union ineffective as a geopolitical actor, but very important as a stabilizer and reducer of tensions in between. And I think that's going to be a lot of the activity these multilateral institutions. The richer, a more powerful, a large population country becomes, the less it wants to be bossed around by others. So it's not going to share sovereignty.
I mean, isn't the interesting thing also, I mean, this is where Japan is actually a standout, right? Like, how do you start your path towards modernization? How did the Meiji miracle actually happen? And it was the fact that the, whatever it was, 8 Keiretsu families, right, that the aristocracy actually united towards a common goal. And when you look at the middle powers that you've just named that are exploding from a population perspective, they're effectively run by 8 families who hate each other, right? And there is no common goal. And the miracle of Japanese, where Japan is a very, very interesting, sort of role model of successful modernization, right, is exactly that the center was created, right? And that the oligarchs work towards a common goal, not just to enrich themselves, but to actually enrich the common man. And that's exactly what happened in the People's Republic of China in the late 1970s with Xi Jinping, where the monopoly of the Communist Party was ripped open to allow the flies to come into the open window. Sorry, that was a clever reference.
Yeah,
it's a very clever reference. No, but I mean, it was that unleashing and for the central government to provide the institutional framework of the rule of law, right, of property rights, right, of credit, of enforceability of contract, as well as public infrastructure for education and healthcare. That's where the economic growth comes from, and that's where a country like Bangladesh, where a country like Pakistan, right, there are huge question mark over the whole thing, right, on whether you actually have. Never mind what the rest of the world is going to do with you. The question is you yourself. Do you have a German coach? Sorry, I'm making a reference to the British soccer team right now, that actually inspires you and gives you the confidence to actually beat the Argentinians?
I think that Japan got a lot of influence from Europe. For example, the constitution from Germany and parliament system from UK. And after the war from like GHQ from the United States. So something in the middle of systematic solution certain way, and also the in between of US. And I'm starting my psychological organizational psychology MA program in Colombia, but I was also accepted by LSE. The decision I made for Colombia is that UK's this is more systematic approach. Even in psychology. And for individual from, I'm the Korean born and grew up in Japan. So I understand Japanese culture totally, but also I do not be so afraid for change or transformation like Korea.
Right.
And then for me, as individual, as international student, I can seek more, I can strive more in the United States because more focus on individual.
Yes.
So my question is, if the systematic, the systematic approach might be less emphasized for example, AI exploring more, or so. What do you think compared to U.S.? But for example, I know the robotics French company. He just made another company in the United States to have better access to investors. And then Macron invited him to his Asia tour, Japan and Korea. So, but he's in the United States, even French. So what do you think, because I can seek maybe as Japanese role, maybe Japan can seek some hint from European procedure as well, but and then US. But what do you think? Because for finance, finance is inevitable for the economy growth for people, and then some development is necessary in Europe as well. But maybe systematic solutions, way of thinking, might a little bit not encouraging much than individual, startups and investors. What do you think?
It used to be, you're mentioning the London School of Economics used to be blamed for all the problems of post-colonial development because they trained so many people badly in the wrong economics, right? These days they have a more enlightened and more open, more American-style approach, I would say, even though it's a very international school. Look, I think there's no doubt that that we have an enormous amount always to learn from the United States and from the kind of the freewheeling, individualistic way of doing things, and we have to look on and admire it. Currently, the way the Trump administration has treated universities has been to attempt to reduce the capability, the scientific and other capabilities that universities represent, to reduce the influence that they have culturally, commercially, and elsewhere. And a big question surrounding our view of the United States is this a 2-year, 3-year, 4-year phenomenon, or is it a long-term one? I would bet it's a short-term one. You only do that kind of self-harm for a short term before you start realizing that it's a bad idea. But if it turned out to be a long term, then the balance of that kind of argument would change. But I would continue to place bets on the fact that the United States will continue to have the world's most successful startups and world's most successful universities in the long term, because that kind of choking off of initiative and freedom and humanity will be temporary rather than longer term. In Europe, a lot of the issue is not having capital rather than not having ideas. So Stripe payment system, 2 great Irish founders, but they made all their money in the United States.
I love the fact that you bring this up, because Americans are so down on themselves now. And the reality is that it's still an unbelievable dynamic company. You hear a lot over the last 9 months that the hirings of software engineers have turned into firings. Well, now that we've got about 12 months of data, 9 to 12 months of data points on that, you know what's exciting? Of the software engineers who got fired, 82% of them set up their own company within 4 weeks of getting fired.
Right.
And that is just, okay, now it gets very interesting. I have no idea, but like if you think, what Anthropic is the exciting company, that's looking in the rearview mirror. The next Anthropic-like thing is coming out of there.
That's exactly right.
And this dynamism is, whether you are Japan, whether you are Korea, whether you are Germany, whether you are Britain, this is is absolutely spectacular, right? Harry, where's your English shirt? He promised me that if England beat, whom did you beat? The Germans again?
Norwegians.
Norwegians, they're almost German.
Bill, 15 years ago, you wrote about how Japan, India, and China would shape the decade to follow. How did you do in terms of your concluding comments? And secondly, how do you see the Japan-India relationship playing out on the back of the Takaichi Modi loving?
Well, what that book, which you're very kindly citing, very kindly citing, it was that the tensions between Japan, China, and India would be of very great importance. Probably, if I was to write it again, I would give the obviously America was a very important part of that book, but I would have given it a more equal role than I did at that point in 2007, 2008 when I was doing that book. I would put the American relationship with each of those 3 major countries as being a more fundamental contributor to what I was seeking to analyze. I'd say, looking back, so that's almost 20 years ago now, The big disappointment has been India. It's in the following sense that India has not, to the extent that probably I expected and that was kind of widely expected at the time, has not emerged as a regional or even global player to the extent that it looked like it might. Why is that? I think partly it's because Indian growth has underperformed generally. Secondly, it's because of a misunderstanding about, as it were, India, and that India is much more a middle kingdom to itself, which you know better than anyone, but than, as it were, the Indian interest in becoming more global is much lower, perhaps, than we realized. And then maybe the third reason is that actually China friction and other frictions proved to be less important to Indian policy and Indian concerns, perhaps, than I thought that they would be going back 20 years. So that's where the big surprise. India, Japan, yes, it's a very important relationship. Yes, it's continuing to develop under Takaichi and Modi, just as it did going back to Prime Minister Mori and whoever was the Indian Prime Minister at that time, which was where it all kind of began. But is it world shaping? No, it's a valuable contribution. A hedge, yeah, it's an important hedge, but it hasn't been a decisive game changer, of course. So, but I think that's probably the main thing that would have surprised me in that period, that India has come less out of its shell than I thought it would.
I mean, one final comment on that. Isn't it so far that India has been pursuing the same strategic autonomy that you referred to, the omnilateral?
Yes. Yes.
But that's been their game plan for the past 20, 30 years.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, I suppose, Indian history. So they sought autonomy during the Cold War through import substitution and through non-alignment and so forth. That was autonomy with poverty. And they are seeking the game plan since Manmohan Singh and the liberalization has been to seek autonomy with wealth rather than global influence. And I think you're right that the global influence has been of less importance than the search for a kind of autonomy. Yeah.
I just want to go back to China for a moment. We talked how strong America is, but think about quantum computing, for one. Think about AI, they're doing pretty good in that right now. In the drug business now, they are the fastest growing in the whole biopharma, even compared to America. So are we underestimating what's happening in China? That's really the sort of question.
Yeah. Bill?
Bill, I might be overreading your presentation, but I think what I took from it was that on the economic side, since COVID in particular, the world has proven to be remarkably resilient in dealing with a bunch of shocks, wars, pandemics, oil shocks, and so on. It may be the case that politically also the world is proving more resilient than the collapse of the liberal order we might have thought about. As you were saying and listening to you talk, we do seem to be finding in a multipolar world, if that's what it is, there's a lot more kind of self-correcting mechanisms. Even though the UN and the WTO might have been marginalized and be barely functioning, there's a bunch of other ways in which the world continues to deal with each other in remarkably effective ways.
Yeah.
Have we overdone the loss of those, quote, liberal institutions? Did it matter that much?
So, to start with China, underestimate it at your peril. But if you want to develop new products, and you do so, you would say that take 1 billion people and experiment on those and build scale and scope in that market. that's a pretty good place to be. So, yes, I think that things emerge from China more quickly than outsiders expect, simply because the power of that scaling is underrated. So our electric vehicle, is BYD, our BYD showrooms down the street from me in Dublin or in London, are they a surprise? Well, they shouldn't be to anyone who knew about the Japanese car industry in the 1970s, but they were a bit of a surprise, but that's only because people weren't paying attention. So I think pay attention. And the second thing where I would agree with you is that while I think that politically and in terms of kind of national power, if you like, China has been overrated and has probably, I don't mean peaked, but I mean certainly its trajectory has plateaued and it is now weaker. And I think the Communist Party system is weaker than often people have made out. The corporate development should not be confused with that, and the corporate development is stunning and is producing all sorts of fantastic results. So we shouldn't put together, Xi Jinping and what goes on in the Politburo with what's going to happen next in the battery market or whatever, or in those things. Yeah. So I mean, I completely agree with that. Remind me exactly what I had the answer in my mind and it's just gone. Oh, the liberal order. Yes, the liberal order. Yeah, I think it's exaggerated. It's exaggerated. I mean, the fact is that it's important that if you like, the godfather of the liberal order, the United States, has turned against it in a more major way than in our lifetimes we'd seen before. We've seen it turn against it in all sorts of ways during our lifetimes, but not in the major way that has happened most recently. But as you rightly say, that does not mean that that as it were a liberal system or a rules-based system has disappeared. It's just that it's no longer got its godfather, it's more contested. And perhaps expectations about its future development have to be adapted to what you think the role of the United States and the attitude of the United States is going to be. Comes back to Jesper's question about institutions, about those things. But the fact is that system, that apparatus remains absolutely important. Some parts of it have never been very, very effective, including most aspects of international law. For the how many divisions as a pope reason that Jesper cited, that these are norms, not laws, really, and take norms as you wish. But a lot of the rest of the system absolutely is strong, and the resilience and adaptability of the world economy, but also of the political relationships, is why those rules and those ways of settling disputes and ways of conducting yourselves have endured, and I think will continue to do so.